All right, we're back. First real lecture this time, at least in terms of our own doctrines rather than history. Um, Today we're going to start in the Small Catechism. As a brief reminder, just because we didn't actually talk too much about the purposes of the other documents in our confessions and their purposes outside of the Augsburg Confession, the Small Catechism was probably my favorite contribution of Luther's to our confessions because of its purpose. I think its purpose is beautiful. The Small Catechism was written by Luther to be the household guide for how to teach and lead your family as a Christian. It was really written for kids. It was designed so that you could teach your children from this the essentials of the Christian faith. It's very, very short. You can see this is an example with no commentary. You can see how skinny it is. You could read the whole thing in less than an hour pretty easily, unless you have one that has like a bunch of commentaries in it, like most people's tends to. But the actual proper contents of the original Small Catechism is very brief, and for good reason. And we're just going to go through it in order. And I know some of you are thinking, Adam, I did this when I was 14, when I got confirmed. Why do I have to do it again? That's the whole point. The lecture I gave, I talked about this in the last lecture. The lecture I gave at for the church history class over at St. Mark's, when we got to the Reformation, it actually might have been the last lecture, which was like the church today. I held up a Small Catechism. I looked around the room, a bunch of lifelong Lutherans, most older than I am, and I said, when's the last time you read this? And it was crickets. Nobody answered. Nobody. That goes exactly against Luther's intended purpose for the Small Catechism. This is designed to be read daily, that you should go through the catechism, at least in part, every day, as a constant reminder of the essentials. Back to basics. This is how we think of like any skill set. So why should our walk with Christ be any different? Why shouldn't we constantly go back to the basics, right? And that's what we're doing. And I will do my best to go more in depth than you might have done in your confirmation class, or at least try to engage with you in a way that's fresh so that it won't be just me vomiting information at you. So we're going to start where the catechism itself starts, the Ten Commandments. And again, I can already hear you. Adam, we already know what the Ten Commandments are. Can't we move on? It's remarkable to me. Every time I read the catechism on the Ten Commandments, I walk away feeling as if I understand the commandments even more deeply, even more profoundly, because of how much theological richness is baked into it. Entertain this with me, right? Humor me, okay? I'm not going to make anyone name all 10 commandments. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. I did that the first time that I presented this, so I won't do it again. The first commandment, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. This commandment already gets us into some trouble with some other Christian denominations and churches. There are two numbering systems, kind of. The systems are kind of squishy and have some variations, but excuse me. The Eastern numbering actually breaks this commandment into two commandments. The you shall have no other gods before me is one commandment, and you shall not make any graven image is a second commandment. We lump those together into one, which was inspired by and influenced by how St. Augustine and those in his camp numbered the commandments. It really doesn't matter, but the way you understand these commandments might be influenced by how you number them. Our Reformed friends follow the more Eastern numbering, where they would make, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, as the second commandment, independent of you shall have no other gods. And I'm not saying that they follow that numbering system to justify this belief, but it is strengthened in their numbering. Our Reform friends typically believe that you cannot depict God in images, statues, paintings, whatever. This is a belief called iconoclasm, or aniconism is a less radical version of it. At least that's how some people use those terms. There is sometimes, this is a false accusation against us, that we intentionally lump that part of this commandment in as an excuse so that we can have images of God. Both of these framings are false. The Reformed don't split them up to justify their aniconism. We do not lump them together to justify our iconophilism. I think that's the word. We're okay with images, basically. An iconophile is someone who uses religious imagery. That's what I'm getting at. But the meat and potatoes of the commandments is the same, and I'll explain. So what does it mean then to not have another God? To not make graven images? What does that actually mean? Well, there's an obvious intended meaning. You can't worship the triune God of the scriptures, but also worship Krishna. That doesn't work. That's a very clear violation of this commandment. But is that all that it means? What about money? What about addictions, drugs, right? Your job, your favorite hobby, another person, whatever, right? The way Luther describes what having a God is to somebody in his larger catechism is he describes it as that which all your needs are met. I think another good way to describe what it is to have a God is to make something the priority in your life. If anything takes place over God, that thing is your God. So if fidelity to your employer is more important to you than fidelity to your God, then your employer is your God. You with me? So there's a lot of things that can be another God. Money, sex, drugs, again, careers, name it, whatever. Whatever your favorite hobby is, NASCAR, I don't know. These things can be a God to you. And this is why we lump that graven image aspect into it. It's the same thing. What was the golden calf? It was another god to these people. It was treated that way. And we can look to the example of the serpent, the bronze serpent on the pole, right? That wasn't actually forbidden to be made, even though it was sort of in some sense, an icon of God. At least it was ordained by God as a useful tool that had a use and a divine purpose. But it was once that serpent was treated as God, once the serpent was worshipped, not okay, violation of the commandment. So that's what we would say a graven image is. Right? You with me? So anything that takes the place of God in your life is a violation of this commandment. So then, is it simply good enough to avoid worshiping other deities? Is that how you faithfully maintain this commandment? No, right? There's more to it than just a negative. There's also a positive. Luther does this beautifully in his catechism. So what is commanded then of us to do, positively speaking? Make God your everything. This is how I love Luther's writing. This is how he answers it. Simple. What does this mean? We should fear, love, and trust in God above all things. You have to trust him more than you trust yourself, your spouse, your employer, whatever. God is where you find your rest, that which you place your trust in. Make sense? Simple enough, right? Excellent. Second commandment, according to our numbering. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. How would someone take his name in vain, right? There's the obvious answer, using the name of the Lord as an expletive when you're excited, surprised, feeling any emotion whatsoever, basically, is how people end up using his name. That's certainly using it in vain. I think that's how most of us were raised to understand this commandment. You can't go out and say, I don't want to say it, but something to that effect. But there's more to it than that, of course. How else can we take his name in vain other than just using it as an expletive? False promise is a big one, I think. I swear to God, I'll do it, right? If you do this, I swear to God, I'll never do that thing again, whatever. Using his name in this casual manner to make vows that aren't really worth anything to you. The way I see it is to take God's name in vain is to simply use his name in any way that lacks the reverence that his name is due. But it's not just your speech, it's your actions. For those in the clergy, I think this is especially prominent because the clergy stands as the representatives of the church, right? So they stand in a place of authority, that the name of God is effectively what it's what they stand for. So their own actions, if the members of the clergy, especially, this is true of all Christians, but I think that the clergy need to especially be aware of this, is that if your actions are not reflective of God, and you're running around in a clerical collar or you're preaching from the pulpit, but you aren't acting as Christ has called you to act, you are misusing his name by the virtue of your station. And again, this is true of any Christian who acts out of turn while simultaneously claiming to be a Christian, especially if you're sort of making your faith public or you're flaunting it, which you shouldn't do in the first place. But my point is to say that to utilize the name of God or his image, his likeness, anything of the sort, in a way that lacks due reverence or is selfish or you are insulting it in your behaviors, all of this is a violation of the second commandment. But let's see what we learned from the first commandment. So it's not good enough to simply avoid using his name in vain. What do we need to do instead? We need to praise it. We need to herald it as holy. You ever think about that? Well, the Lord's Prayer is its own lecture, but do you ever think about that line, hallowed be thy name, right? We are to speak highly of God. We are to praise God and worship God. Again, I won't steal the words out of Luther's mouth. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not curse, swear, use witchcraft, lie, or deceive by his name, but call upon it in every time of need. Pray, praise, and give thanks. It's beautiful. So the way that we faithfully uphold this commandment is to cry out to God when we need him, to praise him and to worship him and to glorify his name. Not only avoid misusing his name, but using his name appropriately. With me? Awesome. Beautiful. Moving on then. Making good time. This is great. Third commandment. This one will also get us into trouble, so we might spend a few more minutes here. The third commandment. You shall keep the Sabbath day holy. What is the Sabbath day all about? Right? We think of it how it was understood in the Old Testament, right? It was the seventh day of the week where you were meant to abstain from all unnecessary labors, right? Really all labors for the most part is how it kind of got understood around Jesus' time. You see Jesus getting yelled at by the Pharisees constantly for doing things that they thought he shouldn't be doing on the Sabbath, right? So, before I ask the typical questions, there's a couple things we need to understand. The Sabbath, you can read more about this in the larger catechism, but the Sabbath as we understand it as Christians is not in the legalistic sense that the Pharisees taught it. The Sabbath, the Lord of the Sabbath is Christ himself, and we enter into Sabbath rest in our faith in him. The purpose of the commandment for the Christian today isn't to command this legalistic 24-hour period where we must abstain from any unnecessary labors. Rather, it's simply saying the church is called to come together in corporate worship. It's a call that as his church, we should set aside a day, a time to come together, to celebrate around word and sacrament at the altar. That's all 100% true and valid for that commandment. But what that commandment is not saying is that from midnight on Sunday morning to midnight going into Monday morning, that 24-hour period that is Sunday for the Christian, that one can't go into work if work calls them in, that you can't run errands, that you can't go out to eat, that these things. That is not at all what the commandment is saying. What the commandment is saying is that if you're doing those things instead of going to church, there's something wrong. There's something flawed in your priorities. Go back to the first commandment, right? So how does the Christian today faithfully uphold the third commandment? What does this mean? That we should fear and love God so that we do not despise preaching and his word, but consider it to be sacred and to gladly hear from it. Okay, do you notice what he did there? The negative, we don't despise his preaching, we don't avoid it, we don't try to get around it, we go to church, we worship, we celebrate. But consider it sacred and gladly hear and learn it. You ever wake up on a Sunday morning, your alarm goes off, and it's time for church? And you go, ugh, right? I have to wake up an hour early today. That might not seem like much. But if you allow yourself to treat corporate worship as a burden, if you don't come here to rejoice and celebrate in the presence of God, especially in his presence at the altar, are you faithful to this commandment? Not really. No, this is an attitude check. This is saying that not to just be this heavy-handed command, like you better have fun at church today. No, that's not what it's saying. It's trying to remind you and say, don't forget what goes on here. Don't forget the gifts that God has given his church in word and sacrament. Go, be joyous, celebrate. So yes, it's saying check your attitude at the door, but it's also reminding you how incredible this place is. So how do we keep it holy? We show up. We worship. We receive his body and blood. We hear the word preached to us. This is how we remain faithful to this commandment. And if at 2 p.m. you and your buddies after church want to go out and have a burger and talk about Bible study, go for it. It's not this legalistic thing. It's reminding us that the Lord's Day is a gift, not a burden. With me? Excellent. Fourth commandment, you shall honor your father and your mother so that it may be well with you and you may live long upon the earth. I think the wording of that commandment, it's funny in an innocent way that I think if you read it wrong, it could sound like you better listen to your mom and dad or they're going to take you out. It says you may live long upon the earth. We've all heard our mother say something like, I brought you into this world, I could take you out. And this commandment seems to support that. But what is that saying then? Honor your father and mother. How do we do that? I think there's an easy example. Children, listen up. Do your chores. When mom and dad tell you to do something, you do it. So long as what they're asking you to do is not sinful. And no, it's not sinful to ask you to do the dishes or to take out the garbage. So you honor them by listening to them. And this doesn't expire at 18 years old. You honor your father and mother so long as you live. So how do we do this then? Is it simply just doing what they ask? Hopefully you're catching on. No. Yes, there is that command. You must listen to them insofar as what they are commanding is in line with God's word. But additionally, we can honor them, and we must honor them in a great many ways. Let's listen to Luther's language. We should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents and masters, but treat them with honor, serve and obey, and hold them in love and in high esteem. Yes, kids, you violate this commandment when you call your mom a loser. Think highly of them. These are the people that God has ordained to bring you into this world. So you honor them not only by listening to their commands, but by doing and acting in sorts of ways that would make them proud. As I sit here giving this lecture, my parents aren't sitting in the room with me, but I need to make an attempt, and I pray that I'm doing well, to honor them by being honest, by being kind, and living in the virtues that my parents raised me to have, So I must attempt to honor them in my own behaviors. I think of my grandparents, right? My grandparents they're old. My grandpa's 94, and he's got real bad eyesight, real bad hearing, real bad knees. Pretty much the only thing that works is his brain. My grandmother, on the other side, she's got Alzheimer's, but her physical health is actually quite good, but her brain isn't that great. So really, they make one fully functioning human being between the two of them, but they need help. They can't do it all on their own anymore. And they're in a wonderful assisted living home, and that's huge for them. But my dad, man, does he do a great job with this commandment. He takes care of them. He honors them by giving them the care that they gave him when he was growing up as a little kid. He helps them around their house or their apartment. He writes their checks for them. He checks in on their medicine. He gets them to and from their doctor's appointments. He honors them by taking care of them. So there's a great many ways that we do this with our parents. But it's not just our parents. Interestingly, do you notice that word Luther includes? Our masters. This commandment is not only mom and dad, but it's your boss. It's your local government representatives. It's your police. If you're unfortunate enough to live in a homeowners association, honor them. I might have just violated that commandment with that joke. The point of this is to say that God expects us to respond well to those that he has placed over us, even if it might seem unfair at the time. We're constantly called to obedience and to honor those people. How do you honor your boss? You do a good job. Even if your boss has been mean to you this week, you still go out and you do your job the best way you can. To honor them is not only to be obedient, but to do everything in your power to bring honor to them. Again, honor, serve, obey, and hold them in love and high esteem. So even when your parents or your boss or your governor, whatever, whenever they're hard to love, gotta try to find it in yourself to do so. The life of a Christian is one of servanthood, a joyful, loving servanthood, not this indentured servitude of having a whip to your back sort of slavery, but one of a loving submission to the authorities that God has placed over us, because ultimately God himself is the source of all authority, right? So we honor God by honoring those that he has placed over us. Again, do you notice how he starts this commandment too? We should fear and love God so that we do not despise or anger our parents and masters. So all of this roots back to God, right? You with me? Beautiful. Fifth commandment, you shall not kill. I expect you're catching on to the trend. Is it good enough to simply abstain from murdering somebody in cold blood? No. So what can we do in addition to simply not unjustly ending the life of another? Yeah, we can take care of other people's health. We can look out for them. We can assist them. Luther's language, we should fear and love God so that we do not hurt or harm our neighbor in his body, but befriend him. That's interesting. And help him in all the needs in the trials of his body and his life. Do you notice that I point out that word befriend for a reason? Because scriptures don't only describe ending someone else's life as murder, they describe hatred of another as murder, right? So to hate your neighbor is to commit murder. So, if we're picking up on the trend, what's the opposite of hating him? Befriend him, love him, care for him, assist him in all the needs of his body, right? So it's not good enough to simply avoid doing damage to other people. We need to be constantly on the lookout for ways that we can care for others. Pick up their burdens. That's hard. Man, I have days I'm lazy. But, I've got an elderly neighbor, and if his driveway needs to get shoveled and I have the time and the ability, I should really go shovel his driveway, help him mow his lawn, bring his groceries in, right? Because these are things that I can do to help him, to befriend him, to love him, and to care for him. That's how we can be faithful to this commandment, to look out for those that God has placed in your life. Yeah? With me? Excellent. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Is it good enough to simply not sleep with your neighbor's wife? No, it's not good enough to simply abstain from being an adulterer in terms of physical intimacy. We should fear and love God so that we lead chaste and decent lives in words and deeds. And spouses love and honor one another. Interesting. So it's not only about just, see the trend here? It's not only about simply abstaining from sexual impurity. It's about honoring your spouse in the context of your marriage. So, see, if you got to be tracking with me by now. We're halfway through. If it's not good enough to simply abstain from physical intimacy from someone other than your spouse, or just physical intimacy with someone else's spouse, what's the positive then? In the context of your marriage, it is loving and caring for your spouse even when it's impossible to do so, right? Again, let me bring my grandparents into the equation here because I love them and they're incredible examples of faithfulness to God. My grandparents have been married, I don't even know how many years. I think over 50, it might be over 60. I can't remember what their last anniversary was. But, at this point in their lives, the way that they can be faithful to this commandment, because, some retirement homes maybe have this problem, but generally speaking, the issue in marriages of people in their age group is not marital affairs. So does that mean this commandment is of no importance to them? No. What this commandment is to them is that, kind of like I said, how they're one fully functioning person. My grandpa can be faithful to this commandment with my grandmother when they are sitting at the dining room table and they just ordered their food and the waitress walks away and my grandma goes, "Are they ever going to come take our order?" And she'll ask 15 times. My grandpa lovingly, patiently says, "We already placed our order. The food will be out in a minute." And he doesn't get impatient with her. He doesn't get frustrated with her. He just answers her question over and over and over again. That is faithfulness to this commandment. And my grandmother, being the one whose knees work, whose eyes are usable at least, she can help my grandpa see the buttons on the TV remote. She can help my grandpa adjust his chair. She can get him something from a cabinet that he, can't balance himself to grab or whatever. She can do these little physical things to assist him. It's beautiful. The question of adultery is totally foreign to what I'm talking about, but it is no less fidelity to this commandment. Just so, in the context of a, young, physically healthy couple, yes, the the aspect of not committing physical adultery or emotional adultery with a person outside of your marriage, of course, you're still prohibited from doing that, but all the same things apply. It's patience with your spouse when they're driving you insane. It's loving them even when they are impossible to love. That is how we remain faithful to this commandment. And we all, again, like we all fail this. We all get impatient. We all make mistakes. But this is how we're commanded to operate in the context of our marriages. Right? You with me? Beautiful. 7th commandment, you shall not steal. Is it good enough to simply avoid kicking down the local 7-Eleven's door and holding the guy at gunpoint to empty out the drawer? Is that all you have to do? No. Not only is it not okay to steal, what do we have to do instead? Luther's language. We should fear and love God so that we do not take money or goods away from our neighbor, nor get them for ourselves by fraudulent deals or deception, but help him to improve and increase his goods and business, and do our best to preserve his wealth and make his condition better. How cool is that? So yeah, obviously, like, you can't go rob a Quickie Mart. Like, that's not okay. But you need to do everything in your power to help others in their own endeavors. You know, one thing I think of that I think this community does a beautiful job of, the music community. When a local musician is putting out a new album, it is so unbelievably important that the word gets out so people buy CDs or download the music off of Apple Music, whatever. Because otherwise, these artists, throw thousands of dollars at these recordings and then nothing ever happens to it. The local community is so amazingly good to make sure that even if you're not a fan of the type of music that other musicians make, everybody buys everybody's albums. Everybody goes to everybody's shows and leaves money in tip jars, and we build each other up to try to help to help everyone else elevate their status in the music scene. It's a beautiful way of contributing to this. Admittedly, the music scene is like horribly sinful, and it's full of terrible stuff that a good Christian needs to navigate carefully if they go into that. But my point is to say, this idea of a community building each other up, people leaning on other people and building one another up, not taking business away from one another, but trying to build up everyone else's business. So that's what we can do. Not only can we do everything in our power not to get in the way of the income of others, but we can try to do our best to improve the income of others. If you have an open spot at your employer that your friend would be a really good fit for and it'll give him a raise, you should really try to get your buddy that job, right? These are all ways we can be faithful to this commandment. But notice, it also says we can't take money or goods away from our neighbor, nor get them for ourselves by fraudulent deals or deception. So this can be something as simple as like insurance fraud, right? You break something and then you buy the extended warranty over the phone after you break it, so you can get it repaired, even though you didn't think you needed that warranty in the first place. That's theft. But it's not just money though either. Money or goods away from our neighbor. One example that that some people might think this is ridiculous, but I think it applies here. He'll probably watch this and laugh at me. I have a friend who I just will not play Monopoly with him anymore. I just won't do it. Or if I do, I will not let him be the banker, because he will somehow accrue thousands of dollars that nobody can account for. Sure, it's a harmless game, but it's deceit. It's stealing. And ultimately, it's seeking to gain, even just this meaningless victory in a stupid board game. It's still trying to win in an unfair, kind of slimy way. And he knows that. We all know he does this. He knows he does this. He admits it. So I'm not saying anything that he wouldn't admit in public. But my point is to say, like, oftentimes we overlook how easy it is to violate God's commandments. Because we read something like "don't steal," and our brain does think like, "I'm okay, fine. I won't go, I won't go rob my neighbor of all their goods." It's much, much, much more than that, obviously. So it's being honest in everything we do financially, and it's seeking to build those up around us financially. I think supporting small local business is a really great way to build upon what we're called to do in this commandment, because you're supporting those around you that God has placed in your life, right? These are all things we can do to be faithful to that. Good? The eighth commandment: you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Is it good enough to not make up stories about your neighbor? No. How does Luther describe it? We should fear and love God so that we do not level false, intentional lies against our neighbor, nor betray, defame, or slander him, but defend him, think and speak well of him, and understand and interpret everything in the best way. Holy cow, I'm bad at this one. How many times are you driving on the road and someone cuts you off and your first thought is, what an idiot. Who gave him a license? I think that's probably how most of us react most of the time, right? Is that how we should be reacting, though? Or should we, in our best efforts, assume, man, that person is, late for work, and if they're late one more time, they're going to lose their job. I really hope they get to work on time, and I hope they get there safely. Man, they might have a sick kid in the back of their car, and they're trying to get to the doctor or the hospital, whatever. I really hope they get there in time. I'll pray for them. That's the difference, right? It's assuming the best in people. And I want to take a minute on this commandment. I want to break the fourth wall a little bit and talk right to a specific group if I can. There's a really shameful trend of behaviors in a certain scene I run in, for a lack of a better word. I'm heavily involved in inter-Christian polemics and apologetics, which basically means like Lutherans and Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Anglicans and Presbyterians all arguing about who's right. I'm far more involved in that than I want to be. But one thing that tends to happen, because this has effectively devolved into a competitive sport at this point, it's hardly about a pursuit of truth, and it's more about just scoring points. Oftentimes what happens is people will weaponize citations from the Bible or from church fathers or theologians, whatever. And they will try to find as many single quotes and citations as possible to lob like hand grenades at the opposition and say, look, this guy agrees with me on this, and that means you're wrong, and things like this. I specifically think of one figure that everybody wants to claim, St. Augustine, one of, if not the greatest minds in the history of the church outside of the apostolic age. I mean, he's the father of Western Christianity, period. I mean, all of us draw so heavily on him. And so everyone naturally wants to claim him. Everyone wants Augustine to be a Presbyterian or a Roman Catholic or a Lutheran, whatever. So what'll happen is someone on one side of the conversation will find a statement from St. Augustine where he says, oh, these councils correct each other, and all of these things stand so inferior to the Holy Scriptures. And the Lutheran will see that citation and say, wow, he agrees with the Lutheran Church on our understanding of Scripture being the highest authority in the church. And I am convinced he does believe that, but that's not the point. But the Roman Catholic will find another citation in Augustine that says something that sounds very much antagonistic to that other statement, where he'll say something like, if it were not for the authority of the Catholic Church, I should not believe the Scriptures. And the Roman Catholic will weaponize that statement. The Lutheran will weaponize the other one. And thank God there are good people on both sides earnestly trying to really understand what Augustine believed. But there's a lot of people who do not make that honest effort. And what they'll do is they will fail to represent the other side properly. And this Lutheran over here will say, it's preposterous to say Augustine believed anything that the Roman Catholic Church believed. And then the Roman Catholic will say, it's preposterous to believe that Augustine believed anything the Lutheran Church believes. When in reality, there is overlap with both of our churches, and there's things that both of our churches would probably disagree with St. Augustine about. Think about how many people are being affected, and think about what a grievous violation this is of the Eighth Commandment, right? The Lutheran is misrepresenting what the Roman Catholic believes. In many cases, he won't represent their positions fairly, and he'll straw man him, and he'll slander their positions, and the Roman Catholic will do the same thing, vice versa, weaponizing these quotes from St. Augustine. So these two have been wronged by each other. St. Augustine has been wronged because there's two people misusing him, or at least not representing him fairly, painting the whole picture. So this great saint who's been with the Lord now for 1,500 years is being misrepresented. And the listeners of this dialogue are not being given the full picture. They are not being given all of the information, and they're being swayed off a false bill of goods. Holy cow, so many people have been hurt by this violation. So why do I use this specific example other than I'm involved in this specific area? Excuse me. I point this out just to demonstrate that something that might not seem too bad on the surface, I know that it's more nuanced than this with Augustine, but I'm just going to hammer this quote home because it wins points. Maybe to that person it doesn't seem all that bad, but look at the fallout. Look at how that just spreads like wildfire and causes more problems. This is the same thing about like making up that you're sick so you can't go to work, something we've all done before. We've probably all done. If you haven't, God bless you. But you see what I'm saying? Like even these things that don't seem that negative on the outset have unbelievable consequences. And need I remind you what the scriptures say? When you violate one law, you've broken them all. So it's important to remember that, like, even if something might not seem too bad, it's no less a violation of God's law. And I want to demonstrate how easy it is to violate God's law in really profound and grievous ways, even if it doesn't seem that way. Make sense? Do you kind of see where I went with that analogy and like why I brought that up? Okay, perfect. Awesome. We're almost done. 9th commandment. This will get us into trouble too. The 9th and 10th commandment for us are divided into two, whereas our Reformed friends and those who use the Eastern numbering system will lump our 9 and 10 together as one commandment. Which again, I'll explain why we don't do that. But the 9th commandment itself, you shall not covet thy neighbor's house. This one's a little trickier, I think, just to explain the basic meaning, because I think at one point it's easy to think, okay, well, I'll just make an attempt not to be jealous of those who have more than me. That's true. That's a good application of this commandment. We should learn to be content with what we have, even if we have far less than somebody else. But I want you to pay attention to Luther's language here. What does this mean? We should fear and love God so that we do not craftily take our neighbor's inheritance or house and get it for ourselves on the pretense of justice and legal right, but help and be of service to him in keeping his fortunes undiminished. There's a lot there. So it's not just about this sort of selfish desire. Because again, it's not sinful especially if you're in like a kind of a especially poor situation, to look at those who have more and think, man, I wish that were me, right? Especially for people who are living in really unfortunate, uncomfortable situations. There's nothing wrong with wanting better for yourself. It's not what this commandment is saying. This commandment is telling you that you have no right to sort of weasel your way in to lay claim to things that aren't yours. Again, that we do not craftily take our neighbor's inheritance or house. I've never had to sit in on one of these yet. Thank God. I'm sure I will one day. But, a lot of times at the death of a grandparent or like the patriarch or matriarch of a family, dispersing their goods can be kind of a nightmare between the survivors of the family, right? And if someone's made a will and testament, let's say, a really clear way you might violate this commandment would be to try to weasel your way into inheriting something that you don't actually have a right to. And this is true, especially outside of the family, trying to cut in and get a promotion you don't deserve and getting in the way of someone else who does deserve that promotion actually getting it. That's claiming a sort of inheritance that isn't yours. So there's this immaterial aspect to this commandment saying, don't weasel in to try to get things that aren't actually for you. And in addition to that, it is also just talking about earthly possessions. Don't try to screw people out of a deal. Don't try to swindle people into giving you something at a price that it's worth way less than. For example, pay a fair price for the things that you're purchasing. All of these things are wrapped up in being content with what you have and not having the selfish coveting for that which is not yours. So your neighbor's car, your neighbor's house, your neighbor's bank account, whatever. So avoiding that sort of selfish, sinful, almost lustful yearning for these things and learning to be content with what you have. But again, help and be of service to him in keeping his fortunes undiminished. If you see your friend making a bad financial decision, tell him, help him out. If you think your friend is spending money on the wrong things, tell him, help him with that. This applies with the seventh commandment too, in terms of you shall not steal, but give, right? There's this positive aspect that you need to be charitable and assist your neighbors and the people around you with what the gifts you have and dispersing those to others. That's the opposite of coveting, is ensuring that you take what you have and you afford those things to other people, right? So you have to be of service to him in keeping his fortunes undiminished. So why then do we distinguish that from the 10th commandment, which says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his servant, nor his maid, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is his? Where's the distinction between the two? Because they are both talking, at least in part, about possessions. Concrete examples. Admittedly, the 9th commandment has this sort of immaterial focus in terms of inheritance and gaining a right to things that isn't yours. And the 10th commandment speaks of these more tactile, concrete examples. There's something else there, though, that I think is worthy of focus. And I think this is the main focus and the distinction between these commandments. Wife, servant, maid, ox, donkey. This is talking about life in the 10th commandment, where the 9th commandment is talking about inanimate objects broadly. So possessions, estates, money, right? Again, I use the examples of like a fancy car, a nice bit of land, right? Things like this. The 10th commandment is saying people, animals. I know most people don't have livestock today, but if you do, or if your neighbor does and you're really jealous because he's got like a prize horse or a really good dairy cow or something, this command would obviously apply. So the distinction here is saying that we shouldn't seek to, and I'll read you Luther's language, we shouldn't seek to encourage the living people, things, if there are livestock, but for most people today, it's referring to a person's family, because most people also don't have like maid servants, unless you're super rich and you have like a butler or something, or or a residential cleaning service or something like this who lives in your house. But generally speaking, this will be talking largely about spouses, children, family members, that we don't want to entice them away from our neighbor to serve us instead. Again, Luther's language is we should fear and love God so that we do not alienate, abduct, or entice our neighbor's wife, servants, or cattle away from him, but urge them to stay and do their duty with care. So the focus here is to say that We need to encourage our neighbors' families to work together, to love one another, to build each other up. We need to encourage spouses to be faithful to each other, right? We uphold the 10th commandment by going back and making sure that we make sure other people are not committing adultery. I'm not saying kick indoors and break down affairs necessarily. That's not a great way to handle that. But to say that we need to encourage our neighbors' families to love one another and build each other up, to offer help to our neighbors' families when they're struggling, to be an ear to listen, a shoulder to cry on, right? This is how we can be faithful to this commandment. And again, both are talking about earthly possessions and even some immaterial, some inanimate, because this does just say anything that is his. So there is that sort of focus on estate versus possession. But I think the main distinction is inanimate, just earthly possessions that can be bought with money, and living, breathing people, creatures. And again, let me go back and I'll read you the 9th commandment too. That we should fear and love God so that we do not craftily take our neighbor's inheritance or house and get it for ourselves on the pretense of justice and legal right, but help and be of service to him in keeping his fortunes undiminished. So again, this focus on his earthly temporal possessions, his house, his money, his estate. And then the 10th commandment, we should fear and love God so that we don't alienate, abduct, or entice our neighbor's wife, servants, or cattle away from him, but urge them to stay and do their duty with care. So how do we do both of those then? We help our neighbor take care of what is his in terms of his possessions and his estate, and we encourage his family to stay and to love one another within the context of their family, and of course, love those outside of their family too. You know, one thing I think is a good way that I think us Midwesterners are especially good at least I hope we're still good at this. The whole concept of like bring it back better, you know, you borrow your neighbor's lawnmower and you bring it back clean. You bring it back with a full tank of gas. You might sharpen the blades if you have the know-how. How can we the 10th commandment? What can we do? Well, if the neighbor kids are having trouble in school, you can help tutor them if you know the subject. You can offer to babysit if mom and dad are having a hard time balancing work schedules. You can do everything in your power to assist a family in their own functions and to support their family structure and encourage them to love one another and build off one another and provide assistance where we can. Right? You with me? So let me ask you a couple closing questions then. What does God say in summary of all these commandments? He tells us in Exodus 20, 5-6. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and the 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Excuse me. So what does this mean? God threatens to punish those who transgress and violate these commandments. Therefore, we should fear and dread his anger and do nothing contrary to these commandments. But he promises grace in every blessing to all who keep these commandments. Therefore, we should also love and trust in him and zealously and diligently order our entire life according to his commandments. Now, let me be clear here. Luther is not saying that we somehow earn God's favor by being perfect in our actions. Luther would slap me across the face if I started teaching that. What Luther here is saying is that, simply put, God is pleased in our efforts to follow him, and God is displeased in our failures. But that displeasure is forgiven, right? This is the law and the gospel distinction, that when we make mistakes, we don't need to dread and terror that God is going to damn us every time that we screw up. We simply cry out for forgiveness and know that we have it. What Luther is teaching here is that we can't be passive to God's commands. These things aren't optional. It's not, oh, do these things if you like, but you don't have to. No, we are actively commanded to uphold these things, to do these things as he has ordained them to be done to the best of our ability, which is imperfect. but that we get to do these things not as indentured servants, like slaves in the sense that you and I would normally use that word, but in a loving submission to God. Again, there's a reason the first commandment is the first commandment. All of this funnels back to love of God. The reason we follow the other 9 commandments is because we follow the first. That we have no other gods before him. That we love him and we prioritize him and his will for us. And we do our best to be obedient. That makes sense? I think it can very, very easily be summarized into love God and love your neighbor, right? That's all any of this is. Be good to those who God has placed into your life, and do so out of a fear and love of God. Luther explains every commandment starting that way, that we should fear and love God. And all else funnels from that. And that's so very in line with our thought in our confession of faith. That all of the good that comes forth from us is all the fruit of the Spirit. It all flows forth from God working in us. That love of God, that faith that grasps Christ and grasps his righteousness, that love of God that we have, which is a gift from God himself, it is through that love of God that all of these other commandments even matter in the first place. Because if you lack that love of God, you have no incentive to follow these commandments, because all of these commandments are done out of a loving obedience to him, right? So remember this, that these 10 commandments are not simply arbitrary rules to cage in Christians in their behaviors. They are the how to live your life guide of the Scriptures. That by following these commandments, we will live fruitful, edifying, joyous lives. Again, not without struggle. You are promised you will deal with trials, tribulations, and sorrow, but that you can face those things joyfully and in loving obedience to God and his commandments. So we should do these things joyfully. We should do these things in celebration of the gift of eternal life that God has afforded us through the death and resurrection of his Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. That all make sense? Excellent. As always, reach out should you have questions. That was a lot, I understand. So if there are clarifications you want, please reach out. I will be happy to provide those clarifications. And then next week, we're going to continue in the Small Catechism. We are going into the Apostles' Creed next. I'm very excited for that one. So in the meanwhile, reach out should you need me, and God bless you. We will see you in about a week for the next lecture. God's peace.